Good evening and welcome to the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. My name is Josh Pahigian and I'm filling in tonight for my friend Anouar Majid, our founding director of the center. Anouar sends his regrets that he can't be here tonight. He's watching, no doubt, from our campus in Tangier, Morocco, of which he is the champion. He oversaw its construction, and now he's helping to run the show over there. So Anouar, we know you're here in spirit, even though you're not here physically. Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming Kristen Case, an English professor from the University of Maine at Farmington. She's going to present Walden, the Humanities, and the Classroom as Public Space. Kristen can speak with authority about the value of the humanities in the education of 21st century students. She teaches courses in American literature, environmental writing, and the intersection of the 20th and 21st century American literature and philosophy. She has also published extensively on Henry David Thoreau, Robert Frost, and Ezra Pound, and is the author of American Pragmatism and Poetic Practice, Cross Currents from Emerson to Susan Howe. She has also published her poems in a number of literary journals, and she is the editor of The Concord Saunterer, a journal of Thoreau studies. Please join me in welcoming Kristen Case.
Thanks so much, Josh. How's the sound? Does that sound okay? Okay. And Anouar, thank you so much for this invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And I also want to say thanks to Liz Bennett, wherever you are, for organizing everything and getting me here. Thank you. This is really a wonderful honor. Some of the other names on the list of luminaries who have spoken here before me are a little daunting, but it's a great pleasure. So UNE students, are you guys? You're like over there, right? You guys have read Walden, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. So I don't normally lecture. This is a little bit out of character for me, so I'm hoping that you guys are going to help me pretend that this is a class. Okay, can you do that? Okay, great. That would be really helpful. This is, my lecture is entitled Walden, the Humanities in the Classroom as Public Space, and I'm going to begin by talking about Walden and then get to the classroom as public space part as we go forward. So what I want to start with is just a list of words that are central to what I'm going to say, and you might notice some of you who have recently read Walden that many of them are also central to Walden. So I wanted to kind of start there and just talk a little bit about these words. One of the things that I'll be saying about Walden and talking about in Walden is the way that Thoreau asks us to reconsider our relationship to words and reconsider the meanings of words. So students particularly, although anybody, I guess, are there words up here that you recognize from Walden and think of in terms of their significance to Walden? Anybody? Which ones? Neighbor. Why do you think neighbor is a significant word in Walden?
He talked a lot about like the different neighbors surrounding him, whether it was like nature, whether it was animals, or people that were actually coming by.
Excellent. So you've said so many important things there. First of all, it's a really key word in the text. Brute neighbors is a name of one of the chapters, but it comes up over and over again. And he uses it to talk about both human and non-humans, which is interesting. So human and non-human neighbors. Anybody know anything about the etymology of neighbor, the root of the word neighbor? Somebody does. Harper looks like she does. No, okay, I won't call on you. Anybody? Neighbor? So it's the word is nigh, which means, anyone know what nigh means? It's sort of an archaic word we still sometimes use. Close or near. So the sense of being close to something. So a neighbor is someone you live close to, but not someone you live with. And that's something I think about a lot in Thoreau's use of the word neighbor. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. Other words?
Removal.
Yeah, what about removal?
Like removing yourself from your everyday thing, isolating yourself and contemplating you and being very simplistic.
Okay, terrific. Removing yourself. What's your name?
Stevie.
Stevie. Okay, and the first person who spoke, what's your name? Emily, thanks. So Stevie is saying you remove yourself from your everyday life, and that allows you to kind of get outside of your everyday habits. Am I paraphrasing you right? Yeah, okay, so exactly. There's something about the idea of removal is really important to Walden, that sense of getting outside of your normal everyday life. What about that word, removal? You don't have to know Latin or Greek to know the etymologies there. What about re? What does re mean at the beginning of a word? So I heard somebody like whisper it. What about re? It can mean again, so move again, or what's the other way that we use re sometimes? What's that? From or back. So removal can mean to move again or to move back, in addition to just to move off from something. Great. So all those meanings I think are relevant. Necessity. What about necessity in Walden? Come on, UNE students. I know you read the book. What about the word necessity? What does he do with the word necessity in that first chapter, especially? Or anybody can answer. Okay, I'll give it to you. So I think one of the central functions of that opening is a kind of rethinking of what we mean by this word, and he's especially interested in what happens when we have false definitions of necessity, right? When we think we need something that we don't really need, or when we use that word in a way to kind of create a false sense of what's essential in our lives. So that's another key word in the text. Economy. That's a pretty obvious one, right? The whole first section is called economy. Does anyone know what that root ecos? In the Greek, it's actually spelled O-A-K-O-S, like that yogurt, that Greek yogurt, is called ecos, weirdly enough. So eco, anyone know what that means, that word means? Yeah, home or house, which is really interesting to think about that as the center of the word economy. It means household management, the management of a household. Why do you think Thoreau maybe used that word for the first section of Walden? Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, in that chapter, you talk about like how he started his new home, like bare necessities, and how he did it very minimalist, like building his house.
Yeah, terrific. So it's really all about the construction of a house and his resources in building this house and building this this life on Walden Pond. So it's a kind of how do we normally think of the word economy? Yeah, right, about money, right? And in a larger sense, right, a kind of larger economy. So there's an interesting play there, I think, between his own household economy and the larger economy of which he is also a part. All right, what else have we got? What about experiment and experience? As I was writing this, it suddenly occurred to me that those two words have the same root, and they're quite close, in fact. Does anybody know what that root is? Any Latin people in the room? This one is Latin. Yeah. Anyone know? It means to try. So the sense of trying something and not knowing yet what the outcome is going to be, that there's a test or a trial going on, that you don't know when you're doing an experiment if you're going to be successful. And in the same way, an experience is something that is not completed yet. You're still in it. It's still something you are trying. Okay. I think that's about all. I'm not going to hold off on grace. I think that's about all I have to say about these words. So I'll go forward a little bit. I want to preface what I'm going to say with a couple of things. One is that a lot of this has been said before. And two recent books that talk about a lot of the same themes that I'm going to mention are Martha Nussbaum's Not-for-Profit, a terrific book that came out in 2010, I believe. And for more kind of historical background and numbers and analysis, Christopher Newfield's book, The Unmaking of the Public University, is a really key resource. Further back than that, a lot of the arguments I'm going to make tonight are anticipated by John Dewey in his book, Democracy in Education, which was published in 1916. So nothing I'm going to say here is news. These are arguments that have been around for a long time, although I think our historical moment is a little bit different, as I'll suggest. I'm going to start by saying what I'm not here to do. I'm not here to argue for the intrinsic value of the humanities, although I happen to believe that the humanities are intrinsically valuable. I'm also not going to talk about the immediate practical value of majoring in the humanities, or about the fact that employers want to hire humanities majors, although those are important arguments that are being made, and if you're interested in them, I can point you to those resources. I want to make a different kind of argument. The reason I'm not going to make those arguments, and the reasons I'm not going to defend the humanities, is that I don't really think the humanities are in peril. I think the humanities are going to be just fine. Literature is going to keep getting written and read. It doesn't show any sign of slowing down. People are going to continue to learn other languages and to think about the meaning of existence. Philosophy is going to continue to exist. Languages and literature are going to continue to exist. These activities are not in danger. What is in danger is public access to the humanities, and especially public access to the space of the humanities classroom. That's what I want to talk about today. Because I see humanities classrooms as compromised, beleaguered, fragile, and ephemeral, but nevertheless vital spaces of actual freedom. And because I think the question of who gets to access those spaces is a public issue that should be of concern to all of us. Okay, as we go forward, I'm going to have the quotations from Thoreau that are appearing in the talk up here. The bolded sections are the parts I'm going to talk about, so hopefully this won't be too distracting. It might at first blush seem a stretch to invoke Thoreau, the failed schoolteacher and frustrated Harvard student, in a talk about the value of the humanities classroom in the public university. Did you guys know that he was fired from being a schoolteacher? Or actually, he quit, but he was pretty bad at it, and also was not a terrific student, really hated Harvard. So he seems an unlikely fit for my talk in some ways. But I want to argue that the practices of the humanities classroom, the physical, discussion-based classroom, can be understood as an extension of the Walden experiment, an experiment constituted principally by the gesture of removal. I say removal and not withdrawal. Sometimes people talk about Thoreau's time at Walden as a withdrawal from society. And I think that's not quite right. I think it was a removal and not a withdrawal for a couple of reasons. First, because he thought of himself as going somewhere, not just going away from something, but going somewhere. And second, because he left again after 2 years, as you all know. Removal suggests a kind of continual mobility that caused Thoreau not only to move to Walden Pond, but also to move away from it, to become a sojourner in civilized life again, and, importantly for me, to write a book for his neighbors. Removal, again, we can think of as being both to go again, and to go back. In the conclusion of Walden, he writes, "I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. It is remarkable how easily we fall into a particular routine and make a beaten track for ourselves." So the first definition of removal is to take something away or off from the position occupied. For Thoreau, the position occupied was rapidly industrializing an expanding hub of 19th century New England life and its urgent social pressures and economic demands. But it's important to remember that Walden was not a remote wilderness. Was anybody surprised in reading Walden to find how close he was to town? Was that a surprise for anybody? Yeah, it was like 2 miles. And he regularly walked back and forth. He had all kinds of social contact with friends while he was there. A group of friends even helped him build his house. So this thing that we think of as the great experiment in isolation and solitude was really in many ways a social activity. Lots of it was social. There was a lot of solitude involved, of course, too, but I think that social piece is important to remember. This regular contact is sometimes pointed to as evidence of Thoreau's hypocrisy, but I think it's, in fact, central to what he meant to do there. So people will sometimes say, oh, he wasn't so tough. You know, he went home and his mom made him lunch. And I think that that's, the sociality of his time at Walden was actually really, really important. It was part of what it meant to him to be a neighbor. As we talked about the meaning of the word neighbor. Neighbor is continually used to describe residents of both the town and the woods, and its ubiquity in the text, its constant appearance in the text, is a reminder to us that Thoreau understood his task in Walden to be, in the end, a social one, getting lost, as he writes, in order to find himself again and to realize the infinite extent of his relations. It's worth noting that Thoreau spent nearly 4 times as long on the Walden book, on the manuscript of Walden, on writing it, as he did at the cabin itself. So the experience of being at the cabin led into a much, much longer experience of writing about that experience. That was an essentially social gesture, a movement of that private experience out into the world. Walden was for Thoreau a space apart, close to but in important ways separate from everyday village life, its habitual modes of both thought and being. The kinds of questions that Thoreau went to Walden to ask could not be asked from the confines of village life because they concerned the very foundations of that life. When we consider what, to use the words of the Catechism, is the chief end of man and what the true necessaries and means of life, it appears as if men had deliberately chosen the common mode of living because they preferred it to any other. Yet they honestly think there is no choice left. The great and difficult gift of Walden is its persistent, provocative, sometimes frankly irritating undermining of the power of habit. I don't know the first letter of the alphabet, Thoreau writes at the end of Where I Lived and What I Lived For, and the demand that he makes throughout Walden is that we too relearn to read, to relearn in particular the meanings of words. And I want to stop here and say, did anybody just hate Walden? Be honest. Anybody just hate it? No haters, really? No, nobody in the any Walden haters? It's totally okay. Really? Even here among friends? Okay. I promise we can. It's okay. No? Okay. Usually there are people in my class who hate Walden, and I get it. I totally get it. He's like a friend who. He's like a friend who's a little abrasive, you know, and who kind of gives you a hard time about everything. And sometimes when I'm sitting at my desk and, I don't know, like online shopping or something, I feel Thoreau looking down from the shelf disapprovingly at me. And that it can be hard to have a friend like that. He's provocative. Thoreau's most characteristic stylistic gesture, the use of a word to signify the opposite of its conventional meaning, was really irksome to some of his friends. Emerson hated it, for example. He was always doing things like saying, you all can probably think of instances in Walden where he does this, talking about inheriting things as a misfortune. Or he talks about possessions as making people impoverished, right? So he loved to do this kind of flip-flopping of language and unsettling the meanings of words. And this is something that lots of readers find incredibly irritating. But I would argue that these reversals are more than just gestures, that they signal a kind of reorientation of language and overturning of a whole system of conventional discourse. Recognizing that our language is inextricable from our values, that's part of what I think that overturning is about, that when we use a word, the way we use it, how we use it, reflects something about our values. And I think in overturning those conventional uses, Thoreau asks us to think about the way we use language. Thoreau seeks everywhere to make us question how and what words mean. the greater part of what my neighbors call good, he writes, I believe in my soul to be bad. That's one of those moments where you can find him a little bit frustrating as a friend. So this creates some difficulties in reading Thoreau, and I would suggest that reading the way that he wants us to read, allowing for that kind of redefinition of even the most simple, most basic words, is hard work. It's strenuous work. Thoreau's is the kind of writing that as he says, we have to stand on tiptoe to read. He says that in the chapter on reading. The style, particularly when it's compared to contemporaries like Emerson or Melville or Alcott, is direct and simple and seemingly straightforward. But Thoreau's particular stylistic genius was to combine this kind of simplicity with a subtle philosophical complexity to make the most common language seem, under the slightest pressure of attention, suddenly strange. And I'm going to give an example of this. Okay, so this is the second sentence on the screen, and I want to spend a little time with this sentence, so I hope you guys will help me. This is from the conclusion of Walden. The volatile truth of our words should continually betray the inadequacy of the residual statement. This is a sentence I really hit my head against for a long time. The volatile truth of our words should continually betray the inadequacy of the residual statement. Anybody want to take a crack at that? Or a part of it? What about the volatile truth? What about volatility? What does volatile mean? I see some hand gestures. What does it mean if something's volatile? Unstable, unpredictable, hard to contain, right? Combustible. The volatile truth of our words. It's a kind of funny way of thinking about truth, for one thing, right? That this is not the Platonic idea of truth, that we have a sort of fixed world of stable forms. The volatile truth of our words should continually betray the inadequacy of the residual statement. So our words possess a kind of inner wildness that is their truth, and this wildness, when we're writing as Thoreau thinks we should, betrays, double meaning, I think, there. That is, reveals or discloses, but also is disloyal to, breaks faith with, the inadequacy of the residual statement. So in the middle of the sentence, we have the volatile truth of our words, betrays that interesting doubleness, and then the inadequacy of the residual statement. So something that, residual, how do we read residual in this context? Like residue, right? What is residual? Yeah, leftover, like a husk. Or like a orange, I'm thinking of like orange peelings, right? Something that is left over when you've gotten the good stuff, you've gotten the fruit. So, what's that? A lot of information in the word volatility? Good. So the idea that there's a residual statement that is, how does that relate to the volatile truth? It's a complicated question. The residual statement, or the material form of the sentence, what's left of the sentence printed on the page, exists in a kind of conflict with the volatile truth of our words, or the sort of wild essence of our meanings. But of course, statement and words are always, of course, they're inseparable. If the truth belongs to the words, it has to also belong to the statement. So there's a way in which the double meaning of betrays, I think, captures the way that words can both reveal and resist their own inadequacy, their failures, and also their ability to communicate. Okay, so I show this just as one example of a sentence that I think can be cracked open to reveal a lot more. And it's a sentence I think about a lot as I'm reading Walden, because I think to read Walden with this sentence in mind is to imagine the physical text as a kind of series of residual statements that have to be reanimated, brought back to their volatile truth by a reader who's awake. For Thoreau, writing during the explosion of the industrial age and at the height of Western expansion in the decades leading up to the Civil War, the question of what we mean by our common words, by words like value, labor, solitude, poverty, and weakness, was not a private but a public question, a question for a nation to answer. About the largest technological innovation of his time, the railroad, Thoreau writes, a crowd rushes to the depot and the conductor shouts all aboard. When the smoke is blown away and the vapor condensed, it will be perceived that a few are riding, but the rest are run over, and it will be called and will be a melancholy accident. Here, the word that Thoreau asks us to reconsider is accident. It is only by our collective failure to reckon predictable costs that the casualties of the railroad can be written off as accidental. The lazy repetition of the phrase, a melancholy accident, in the wake of, say, the death of a dozen railroad workers, reflects an acceptance of such things without thought, without choice. Thoreau sought to make such words strange to us, and in this act of estrangement, to prompt us to redefine ourselves as a culture. It was Thoreau's physical and spiritual removal to Walden Pond, a perspective he retained even after returning to the village, that enabled him to articulate a set of questions about individual and social life that we're still struggling to answer. Which brings me to the public humanities classroom. Let's say, since it's a place dear to my heart, the literature classroom of the public university. Let's say it's the room I taught in this morning, 2 classes actually. Roberts Learning Center, room 205, at the University of Maine at Farmington. The architectural style of the Roberts Learning Center is frankly brutalist. If you aren't familiar with the brutalist period of architecture, you should Wikipedia it. I almost put a slide up. Roberts has no Harkness seminar tables, no oak and marble fireplaces like the one that graces the seminar room I recently visited at Harvard's Barker Center, which is home of its English department. Very beautiful place. The space itself is frankly uninspiring. Cinder block walls, fluorescent lights. Because it's Maine, the floors in winter are, in spite of the diligent efforts of the facilities department, pretty continually streaked with mud. The building is either insufferably hot or impossibly cold, sometimes both at the same time, on different sides of the hall. And class is punctuated by the sound of logging trucks shifting gears as they climb the hill on the stretch of Route 4 to which one side of the building is exposed. But it is nevertheless our space. During the 10 minutes before class, while I ready my notes in my office across the hall, I hear the sounds of tables and chairs being dragged in to form a circle. I arrange the furniture this way on the first day of class. The students do it every day after that. I have no idea if it's the same person every time or different people, but the room is ready when I walk in. Nothing in the physical atmosphere of the Roberts Learning Center communicates to my students that what they are doing is important, is valuable, is part of a venerated and venerable tradition. No names etched in marble greet them as they greeted me when I entered Columbia's Butler Library as an undergraduate. But the students seem to know anyway. Even without those things, even with mud on the floor and cinder block walls. They arrange the furniture and they take out their books. They drive from an hour away or trudge from their dorms. They come even though they worked a late shift at McDonald's, and even if they can't, or at the snack bar, and even though they're going through a divorce. And they come even if they didn't understand the reading, and even if they can't register for next semester's class because they haven't been able to pay their most recent tuition bill. They come even though their car is in the shop and they had to walk. They come even though their aunts and their uncles and sometimes their parents ask why they're wasting their time studying English. That sound, the sound of the furniture being dragged across the floor, no doubt disturbing the class in the room below, making the professor raise her voice as she throws out parting words, and the students shuffle for their coats and bags. That sound has become for me a sort of echo across time of Thoreau and his friends raising the little cabin in the Concord woods. No man was more honored in the character of his raisers than I, he wrote. They are destined, I trust, to assist in the raising of loftier structures one day. It is the sound of a space, however uninspiring, being both claimed and prepared. made ready for an experience, a collective activity that even without marble and oak, and in spite of massive cultural and economic pressures pushing them in other directions, our students continue to show up for. Today we're reading Walden, and a student is struggling with the sentence, "By a seeming fate, commonly called necessity, they are employed, as it says in an old book, laying up treasures which moth and rust will corrupt, and thieves will break through and steal." Caleb, whose father is a minister, tells us that the old book is the Bible and refers us to Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. But this leaves us with the trickier first part of the sentence, and we take some time with it. There we go. We take some time with it. Sitting in silence, our books open, the sound of the trucks suddenly louder in the quiet, a few pages turning. Then a hand. Angela, who seldom speaks in class because she thinks she isn't good at English, but whom I often notice leading slightly forward in discussions as if participating silently in her head. She speaks quietly. "Seeming fate sounds like you think you're doomed, but you're really not," she says. Another hand. "But why is fate commonly called necessity?" More silence, more trucks, more pages turning. Angela. "Okay, I'm probably wrong, this is probably wrong, but maybe it's like you say it's necessary, but it really isn't?" Some nodding as this gets absorbed by the room. Then another hand, John, a secondary ed major who has been struggling to reconcile Thoreau's views on education with both his own career plans and his degree of student debt. He's animated, excited. He feels but can't quite express his idea. He spends a few seconds stammering, trying to get it out. We wait. He gets there. It's like we say we need to do things. We need to go to class, or we need to buy something, or we need a new cell phone, but we don't actually need to do any of those things. That's why it's only a seeming fate. Nobody's holding a gun to our head. There's nodding all around now, both because the sentence now genuinely makes sense and because there's a sort of silent support in the room for John and Angela, who did something hard, who risk a kind of public vulnerability for the sake of our common enterprise, our collective work. I can see in his face that John is absorbed by the idea he has just articulated. He's thinking about what it would mean to exercise the freedom suggested by Thoreau's redefinition of necessity. It's true. Nobody's holding a gun to our head. My favorite moments in the classroom are these, the moments in which students are both urgently compelled to speak and at a loss for words. I love these moments because they signal to me that the student has discovered not a new thought, but a new way of thinking. Something that so overturns their habits of thought that they can't immediately say what it is that they've discovered. If a new thought is a new piece of furniture, this kind of crisis in thought is like discovering a room one hadn't known was there. In the movies, such hidden rooms are always hidden behind bookcases. I value these moments not so much for the not only for the intellectual growth they signal, but also because each time a student comes to a new way of thinking, she also learns to be less afraid of future revolutions in thought. I want to note a few things about this experience. First, it happens live, in person, in the room. Shared space matters. Physical proximity matters. The silent nodding matters, the moments of silence, the expressions, the stammering, the moving of furniture, they all matter. We need the protection of the space and the distance from external pressures afforded by it. We are, however fleetingly, a community. The care of the space demonstrated by the students moving the furniture each day is one manifestation of this, and their willingness to risk articulating new thoughts is another. I'd like to propose another historical analog to this space, this one going a bit further back, Anne Hutchinson's sitting room. In the mid-17th century, Hutchinson, a midwife, nurse, and mother of 14, perceived that the Calvinist insistence on grace alone as the key to salvation, coupled with the Puritan understanding of the experience of grace as immediate and unmediated, undercut the spiritual authority of the all-male Boston ministers, who were also the political leaders of Massachusetts Bay Colony. The meetings she held in her Boston home were for her neighbors. At first, only women, later both women and men, and in their very structure, these informal meetings for discussion reflected the belief that grace, the immediate apprehension of divine truth, doesn't observe class or gender or social hierarchies, can happen to anyone, and carries its own authority. Understood as an immediate experience that could be known only to the individual to whom it had occurred, grace made personal experience a ground, indeed the ground, for divine knowledge. In thinking about the humanities classroom as a public space, I want to draw not only on the Thoreauvian principle of removal, but also on this tradition of radical egalitarianism implicit in Hutchinson's understanding of grace. This is the part of the talk where I have to stop and say that this lecture isn't secretly about God. I'm not a religious person, and even if I were, I wouldn't describe the kind of view that Hutchinson had of hell, for example. She was a believer in predestination, and I am not. But the parallels are significant. And descriptions of grace are analogous to the kind of knowledge that can be gained in the discussion-based in-person humanities class. In the same way that grace can't be transmitted from minister to parishioner, but had to be directly apprehended, the kind of knowledge engendered by the humanities class is not conveyed from professor to student. This is the thing about grace. It's not packageable. It's not marketable. It's not content delivered. It's arrived at, like grace, often in a flash, by a student engaged in the arduous, risky activity of synthesizing difficult new material with his or her own past experiences in the presence of other people doing the same thing. I can't make my students have this experience. I can't even say for sure in what the experience consists. Freedom isn't merely the result of this classroom practice. It's part of the process, built in. What will John do? What will Angela do with the possibilities that Walden has opened for them? I don't know. I can't know. The meaning of the freedom of thought that can be opened in the separate space of the humanities classroom is that it's free, that it is not determined in advance, not bound by the demands of the market or social expectation or even institutional authority. We don't escape those things when we enter the humanities classroom, but we can remove ourselves for an hour or two by collective agreement from the force of their power in our lives. We can be in another, freer space, a space in which this kind of grace can happen. Hutchinson's story doesn't end happily. She was accused of heresy, denounced, and banished. But by the 19th century, she was seen as a heroine, pictured by Hawthorne and others as an example of principled resistance that had come to be seen as beneficial not only to the individual, but also to the community. This double movement of, on the one hand, removal or reliance on individual experience as the foundation of knowledge, and on the other, the return to social or community life, is central to Walden, which often vacillates between the present and the past, the solitary life on the pond, and the more outwardly directed life of writing. Classrooms, too, can be places in which experience is built upon and transformed. And Thoreau seems to anticipate John Dewey's experience-based pedagogical theory when he critiques his Harvard education. To my astonishment, I was informed on leaving college that I had studied navigation. Why, if I had taken one turn down the harbor, I should have known more about it. Even the poor student studies and is taught only political economy, while that economy of living that is synonymous with philosophy is not even sincerely professed in our colleges. The consequence is, while he is reading Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Say, he runs his father into debt irretrievably. Thoreau's critique of the classrooms of his day culminates with an observation about the aftermath of education, the future it bequeaths. What happens when students leave college and move back into the community? I don't think I've ever taught Walden and not had students respond emphatically to the way that last sentence resonates with their own experience. The one significant difference being that it is they themselves and not their fathers who they are running into debt. The conversation that day is about their own present and future realities, the jobs that are working well in school, the kinds of choices they have to make, tuition or root canal, tuition or car repairs, tuition or rent, their fears for the future, the kinds of compromises they've already made. It's a hard conversation, sometimes an emotional one, and invariably one that raises for them the question that Thoreau is asking. Is it worth it? This is a tough conversation for me to moderate. For reasons both good and selfish, I want them to answer yes. I want them to believe in the value of the class and of their education in general. But I can't both encourage them honestly to question and hold up my own answer as the final word. Here, much to my own discomfort, I represent the authority, the common wisdom, the institution to be questioned. And insofar as I believe that the value of the public humanities classroom is precisely the opportunity it presents for this kind of questioning, my job is to stay quiet. The verdict that has so far emerged from these conversations has been a somewhat agonized yes. Sometimes someone says, it's worth it because even factoring in debt with a BA, I'll earn more than I would without one. But mostly, the worth question is answered in non-quantifiable terms, in terms of books and classes and ideas and a community that's changed them. The affirmation is earnest, but frankly somewhat ambivalent, because their inner sense of the invaluable quality of what they're learning doesn't erase the fact of debt or the anxiety it creates, an anxiety that creeps in even here, even into our place apart. The move back that is the necessary second half of the gesture of removal has become more and more daunting, an even frightening prospect, and for good reason. The average amount of debt held by 2013 Maine college graduates is roughly $30,000. Many of the students in the deepest debt are graduates of public universities, first-generation college students with little to no financial support from their parents, entering an economy that is especially punishing to the young. So this chart shows, it's adjusted for inflation, and it shows that median income has basically stayed flat, adjusted for inflation. And these are kind of, major spending, the cost of the average car, health spending, et cetera. And you can see what's happened to the cost of college, and that highest increase is the tuition for public college. Over almost 250% since 1983. Where am I? Many of the students in the deepest debt are graduates of public universities, first-generation college students with little or no financial support from their parents, entering an economy that is especially punishing to the young. This is no melancholy accident. It is a clear failure of the promise of public education, a promise that for several decades of the 20th century corresponded to a reality. In response to a situation that no one can deny is a problem, one solution has been proposed. Replace liberal education with job training. Deliver this training as conveniently and effectively as possible. Train students for the new economy. In arguing against this position, I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that nothing needs to change. College professors and administrators have a greater responsibility to help students think about their futures than we used to have. We have to take this responsibility seriously. But these conversations, too, demand proximity, demand trust, demand imagination and openness. We owe it to our students to help them navigate their return to the world outside the classroom. We owe it to them to help them find jobs. But we owe them so much more than that. And to forget that this responsibility is part of a larger responsibility to preserve public access to spaces in which thinking and questioning can happen isn't just to shortchange public university students, it's to shortchange our culture as a whole. Institutions like the Center for Global Humanities are doing what they can. We need institutions like this. We need museums and concerts and libraries and lectures like this one that are open to the public, but we also need classrooms. 25 years ago, state appropriations covered about 70% of the UMaine system's education budget. That number has dropped to about 40% according to generous estimates. Maine is not unique. The defunding of the UMaine system is part of a nationwide decline in support for public colleges that has been acute in the last few years. You're probably aware of what's going on at UCLA. There's been a lot in the news in the past few days about the tuition increases at UCLA. As we've seen at USM and elsewhere, the humanities have been disproportionately targeted, and visions of a streamlined, career-oriented public university with a business model like that of McDonald's or Netflix have been put forth as an alternative to in-person, discussion-based liberal education. The new model calls for faster, cheaper, more efficient content delivery. Last year, North Carolina Governor Patrick McCrory, threatening cuts to UNC's flagship campus at Chapel Hill, said this: "If you want to take gender studies, that's fine. Go to a private school and take it." To my mind, this is a more revealing statement than the more typical wholesale dismissals of the liberal arts and the humanities that one sometimes hear. What McCrory's statement says is that gender studies is fine. The humanities are fine for people who can afford to pay. To me, this statement reveals the real threat, which is indeed already more than a threat, that the humanities aren't dying. They're just becoming a luxury good, a high-end commodity. And I want to suggest that this is a problem, not just for those of us in the public university, but for all of us. If, in the context of today's climate, the idea that the humanities classrooms and the liberal arts in general are a vital public good, if that seems like an extreme position, this wasn't always the case. It was until a few decades ago actually a matter of public consensus. Indeed, a few years after the GI Bill radically altered the social and economic landscape of the United States for the better by increasing college accessibility, the 1947 Truman Report declared, "It is a commonplace of the democratic faith that education is indispensable to the maintenance and growth of freedom of thought, faith, enterprise, and association." To affirm the social value of access to public higher education, to liberal education, was a commonplace. It was a cliche. It was a belief held across the political spectrum that democracy requires true freedom of thought, and that freedom of thought can be engendered by a liberal education. The discourse around the crisis in the public higher education sometimes makes this crisis seem inevitable, impossible to solve, as if high student debt and the elimination of public humanities classrooms are simply new realities to which we have to adjust. The widespread acceptance of this seeming fate, commonly called necessity, demonstrates the need for a Thoreauvian removal, a vision from outside the assumptions of the present moment, of the culture as it is right now. The story of decreased access to college, and particularly to live in-person humanities teaching, is part of a larger story about the concentration of power and money in America in the past few decades. And it will take all of our collective will and intellectual power to begin to solve the problems that story presents. We need economists and policymakers to help solve them, but we also need, desperately, the collective ability to imagine a better future, to ask what words like necessity and public and democracy really mean. This is a practical need. We can't make a better future if the few spaces in our culture dedicated to the hard work of imaginative thinking and radical questioning become luxury commodities. The kinds of upheavals in thought that can take place in a space apart don't merely expand the individual's sense of the possible. They expand our collective power and enhance our collective future. This power, I want to suggest, is a public good that deserves protection. And the spaces in which this kind of thinking, this kind of freedom is made not only possible but publicly accessible are increasingly rare and thus increasingly precious. I want to close with a few facts. Germany just eliminated all tuition fees for higher education. Harvard has a $32 billion endowment on which it pays no taxes. A reporter at The Atlantic, Jordan Weissman, has demonstrated that the federal government could make public colleges tuition-free simply by reallocating money it now spends on programs to make college more affordable. Get your head around that one. tax cuts for the wealthy passed in 2011 in Maine have diminished state revenues by an estimated $200 million. In economy, Thoreau writes, "There is only one way, we say, but there are as many ways as there can be drawn radii from one center." I'm not suggesting a solution here, so much as I am asking that we include these facts in the picture when we think about the future of public higher education in the humanities, when we think about what is possible and what is impossible. I don't have the answer, but one of my students might. Let's give her some time to think. Thanks.
We'll take some questions now from the audience. Maybe some of our students would like to start things off.
We were curious that if you think people outside of academia, like people who do not get to experience formal education, how would they be able to experience the humanities? How would they be able to get the same sort of moments of grace that we have through the humanities?
Oh, that's great. Great question. Well, I mean, there are ways. I mean, I mentioned a couple in the talk. I mean, I think public libraries are absolutely vital, so important, and also, of course, under so much pressure. I think institution like the Maine Humanities Council, which is represented in this room tonight, I believe, that reach out, that their whole mission is to reach out to bring the humanities to the public, do hugely important work. So I think there are ways, but I also think it's really hard. I mean, I think people with full-time jobs and kids at home and, taking the time to participate in a book club or go to a lecture, those kinds of things, it's hard. And traditionally, college has been the time when we set aside that time to really engage intellectually in that way. And I think when people aren't able to have that experience, of course it's possible. They're there for everybody. But having those experiences is really hard, and we need both a public and private commitment to making those kinds of things accessible.
I think that one idea that was really interesting in Walden was when he talked about the idea of solitude and taking time for solitude. And we were just wondering what's a way that could be encouraged, especially in a college life, to really reserve time and take time in a healthy way for that idea of solitude.
It's a great question too. It's hard. So when I teach Walden for my environmental literature class, I make the students go on solitary walks, and I tell them they're not allowed. The kicker of this is they can't bring their phones. So they're not allowed to use. There has to be technology-free walk for 20 minutes for each once a week, and that's even that is asking really a lot. To ask to put the phone down is hard, and I will confess that I try to do this too, and it's hard for me. It's a difficult thing, and our culture has become one in which taking that kind of solitude has become harder and harder because of technology. But I do think it's important, not so much, as I tried to say here, for only what you get on your own, but also for what you can bring back from that solitary experience. So great question. I wish I had more answers.
Hi. So I know you mentioned earlier how a lot of your students, we all know it's true, are going into debt through this college education. How do you sort of reconcile sort of making the med student who just wants to get through school so they can do undergrad, making them take the time out of their day to take the important humanities classes?
How do I justify it? Was that the question? I mean, I think it's most important for that student in some ways. That the more driven you are, the more sure you are, the more you have your eye on that prize, the more important it is to kind of recognize an existence outside of that track and to be reminded of it. I think we all need that. I need that. That's one of the things that, making myself read Thoreau all the time, part of the reason that I do that is that he pulls me away from my normal sense of what's important and makes me question it, makes me think about it, sometimes even uncomfortably so. I think it's really important for all of us, and maybe high achievers in particular.
Speak in the microphone.
Please do, right into the microphone.
Well, my experience with the few really excellent professors that I had was I didn't really think of them as professors. I thought them as guides. And, the context of guides today is that in terms of the current situation that we're in terms of the unaffordability of modern education, that it's possible for you to guide 15 or 20 students. It is impractical for you to guide 100 students. And then we're going to put a camera and have you on the internet and pass out the diplomas after 3 years or 4 years and give everybody a big scholarship because they signed on for the whole prize. I mean, how do you talk about that? Was Walden?
That was like the missing last paragraph of my speech. Thank you.
Well, was Walden an early Luddite, or tell me a little bit about him in terms of what we're facing today? It just seems exponential in terms of the problems and those people that are trying to rob individuals of their ability to be able to learn to be really intelligent citizens. And so that's my question.
That's a big question. I'm not.
Yeah, good luck.
Well, I'll say about Thoreau being a Luddite, his relationship to technology was actually really interesting and complex. And I don't think he was quite a Luddite or would be completely anti-technology today. He actually had a kind of like sort of love-hate relationship with the railroad, for instance, as people probably noticed when they read the chapter on the railroad, or that opens with the railroad in Walden. But I do think, I think that we can't, there is something about the kind of experience of reading a book like this and talking about it that is not mass reproducible. I mean, I just believe that. And I believe it, I believe it's an intensely personal experience, an intensely private experience. And to get students to honestly share something about that experience requires a lot of trust and requires a community. And I think without that community and that kind of intimacy of the classroom, I don't think I wouldn't know how to do it. I guess I'll just say that. Maybe other people would, but no, I wouldn't. Yeah.
If it makes you feel any better, as a physician, the physicians who were majoring in humanities actually present a more powerful and compassionate physician than those that didn't. When I was going through medical school in 1970, if two medical students were having to be chosen between one or another, one who had majored in humanities and one who had majored in the sciences, and this is University of Michigan Medical School, they would choose the humanities because they were very clinically oriented. And one of the things that they had in their experience was great physicians come from those who did and have a strong basis and foundation in the humanities. So I think it speaks to a danger that we have in medicine, that we are so immersed in the science of it, so immersed in the biology of it, that we forget what it is we're treating, and that is a human being. And I think what you see in medicine is that those who did pursue a strong humanities major in undergrad before they went on to medical school really turn out in the long run to be more effective and compassionate physicians.
That's a great testimonial. Thank you. Oh dear. Question from the economist in the room.
That's all right. You did a great job with public goods. It's a fabulous concept, and it's one that's not well developed, believe it or not. It's been around a long time, and people can't measure it, the value of public goods. But it's an argument for just about everything that's useful in economics, I think, if you dig deep enough. And I just wanted to, you did a great job with it.
Thanks. There was a longer section on public goods actually at the beginning of the talk, and I cut it because I was afraid I was going to be wrong. And my dad, this is my dad, everyone, was in the room, and he was going to tell me that I had screwed up the economics. So yeah, I mean, that if you go to the Wikipedia page for public good, which I did, there is the first two things are clean air and knowledge. Right, those are the two like classic examples of the public good. So I thought that was pretty appropriate. But thanks, Dad. Any other family members want to weigh in?
I just am wondering, at the university level, are there discussions between the professors in the humanities area and those in the science, technology, engineering, and math, which seems to be getting all the public attention and probably more of the money at this point?
Yes, that's true. Where I work at the University of Maine at Farmington, we have a wonderful small community with a small faculty, and there's conversations going on all the time. It's one of the things I really love about it is that I'm constantly in conversations with friends in the sciences. Actually, I've enlisted Drew Barton, who is a biology professor, to kind of help me with the very basic stuff about biology that I need to know to really follow Thoreau, who was an excellent amateur naturalist, and knowing nothing about that stuff really, I'm constantly needing to kind of educate myself. But it's true. I mean, that there is that the money is flooding in for STEM and not so much for the humanities. So that is part of what we're seeing, I think, in the most recent cuts. And I mean, this is hardly unique to Maine. It's really across the country at public universities.
Thank you for your talk. I especially appreciated your concluding comments where you seem to link the problem to the larger growing problem of inequality. And I'm wondering to what degree you feel the growing inequality within the costs of the university and how they're distributed between what top administrators are paid. Recently on Tom Asgroff, On Point, he was interviewing someone who was talking about the recent pay level at the University of Pennsylvania, which was on par with what a corporate executive would receive or beyond. So that's one part of my question, to what degree you feel that this problem is linked to that. And secondly, your comment about Germany, which illustrates that it doesn't have to be this way and reflects larger indications of values between differing societies, both who are highly industrialized, highly technologized, and highly affluent. There are choices to be made, and I'm wondering to what degree in America, how unique is this to really an American problem, and to what degree we in America who recognize it as a problem are looking to our counterparts across the pond to ask questions about what can we learn from you?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I included that point to illustrate exactly what you said, and that I want to begin thinking about this as something that we as a culture have chosen, and not something that is the way it has to be, right? Seeming fate, sometimes called necessity. But I certainly don't know enough about how Germany has managed this to say, oh, we should just do what Germany did. But I use that to illustrate exactly what you said. And I mean, I think the point about do I think that the allocation of resources in the university mirrors the overall inequality of growing disparity of wealth in the economy as a whole? Yes, I do. And I don't have a ready solution to that either, but I do think the first place to begin with that, with all of these problems, is to think in terms of our choices rather than sort of that this is the way that it has to be. It wasn't always this way. It's not this way in other places. It doesn't seem to be entirely a problem of there's just not enough dollars out there in the world. There clearly are. But where are they going? Who gets them? Those are the kinds of questions that I think the humanities can help us ask.
I think another thing that I've noticed that Europe does really well with is sort of the encouragement for students to take time off before going into college, before going right in, or in between their college years. Do you think that a push towards taking this time for exploration would just lead to a more natural inclination for people to really enter the humanities after that?
Maybe it would. I don't know. I mean, I think time off is a great idea. I mean, for most people, I think it can be something that really helps people kind of learn to think about their whole life and not merely getting a sort of credential or being on a certain kind of track, but really think about life in a holistic way. But I actually think, I think the big obstacles are financial. I think that people aren't. The big problem right now is just that it's too expensive to go to college. That regardless of the timing of it, that would still be the looming issue. But yes, I do think I'm a big proponent of people taking time off at different stages of life. I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
I just listening to all the questions, and at this point in our democracy, meaning this year, and the way the kids are being tested, the way the kids are, the whole scene that's going on. I have 4 kids. 2 of them went into the humanities, got liberal arts degrees. The other 2 went into pharmacy here. And what this fellow was saying about the difference in becoming a person as a physician is unbelievably important, and that goes for everything. And I think that's the way that things really should be, and why our society is not doing it in general, because there's no doubt there's money. The University of Maine system is a mess anyway, and they could easily do it. So my question is, the way that kids are now, and some of these guys, have been through that testing, the mandatory testing and constant testing. And I have friends that are teachers in the schools here in Portland, and the testing has become just everything. And so the time that these kids are coming into college now, they're told about the expenses now, which even 10 years ago they weren't. They were said, people that are in their 30s were said, go to any college you can get into, be the best, all that stuff. And then my 2 youngest, in fact, went into pharmacy because at that point they saw their older siblings with loans that they can pay off, actually. And so my question is, what's going to be the effect of this regimented testing and all of this on just choices like this, in your opinion?
I mean, I only have anecdotal, an anecdotal response to that, but I think that the effective testing, the continual testing that students are undergoing is frightening. In the literature classroom, it's incredible how hard I have to work to assure students that they can venture an interpretation that may not agree with my interpretation, may not be the right interpretation. I mean, just to really get, that's part of what I meant about trust, that these kids they're continually being drilled on getting the right answer on things. And then to say, okay, now I want you to really think about this, right? It's difficult. and that, we wonder why plagiarism is, we see it as much as we do. I mean, I think that there is a sense that, being asked to respond originally it is so counter to the kind of thinking that they've been asked to do. And of course, this isn't everywhere, and I have some wonderful high school teachers in the room who find ways to get students to think creatively and engage creatively and critically. But I think there's so much pressure. There's so much pressure on the teachers and the students to outcomes, scores, numbers. That within that framework, that pressure on everyone, it's a risk to think, to take time to think, and to kind of open yourself to not having the right answer, to even a kind of thinking that that can't be measured in that way. And so part of my thinking about the importance of the classroom is that I need to have a space in which I can say, like, okay, those rules don't apply here. You're safe here. You can say something, and you're not going to immediately fail for getting the right, So I think that's part of why the trust thing is so important.
Thank you to our audience members for asking so many delightful questions tonight, and thank you especially to Kristen Case for bringing us such wonderful food for thought tonight. Everyone, thank you, Kristen Case.